Trump's tariffs against China signal a de facto decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies. Is this sustainable? Will this competition remain in the domain of trade, or could it signal a deeper escalation towards kinetic war? What is the future of U.S. China relations? To better understand what is happening, we're joined by Dr. Victor Gao to take a deep dive on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we will be helping you sort through all the propaganda with an independent view of the country we are told to hate, but know so little about. I'm KJ No. These are this week's headlines. Hundreds of thousands rally against U.S. quizzling authorities in Taiwan. Over 200,000 protesters rallied against the U.S. quizzling DPP leader William Lai this weekend on Ketagalan Street in Taipei, condemning his policies as fascist and dictatorial. There was absolutely zero coverage of this massive protest in Western corporate media. Lai's actions include efforts to eliminate almost 2/3 of opposition KMT lawmakers using politicized recalls and lawfare against key opposition leaders, including the prosecution of the opposition party TPP leader Ko Wen-je. He has also proposed 17 national security measures, including the reinstitution of military courts and labeling China as a foreign hostile force. Taiwan Island was used for decades as an American forward base to threaten and attack mainland China, during which time it was a military dictatorship. As the US re-weaponizes and Ukrainizes the island to prepare it for war against China, the DPP is reinstituting past dictatorial practices as a garrison state. The US quizzling DPP has shut down entire news stations, persecuted students, journalists, politicians, and business people who want good relations with the mainland, as well as deporting mainland spouses. It openly lauded South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol's declaration of martial law. The US, despite this, refers to Taiwan Island as a model democracy. Chinese use quantum computer to improve AI training. Chinese scientists have fine-tuned a 1 billion parameter large language AI model using Origin Wukong, a 72-qubit Chinese computer, one of the most powerful in the world. Fine-tuning is a common step in AI training used to adjust large language models to improve the accuracy of output. Using Origin Wukong, researchers were able to increase accuracy, including an 8.4 improvement in training effectiveness, even when the model size was reduced by 76%. AI development involves large data sets, powerful computing capacity, and efficient algorithms. China has shown its superiority in developing efficient and elegant algorithms with the mathematical shortcuts of DeepSeek and has large, well-tagged data sets. New hardware methods such as Origin Wukong's quantum computing have the potential to give China a significant advantage in the AI competition, which the US has characterized as existential to US power projection and warfighting. China demonstrates the world's first operational thorium nuclear reactor. Chinese scientists have proven that stable, long-term operation of thorium nuclear reactors is now feasible. China accomplished this milestone by adding fresh fuel to an operational molten salt reactor. Thorium is a safer, cleaner, and more abundant alternative to uranium, and this demonstration marks a breakthrough in the generation of clean energy. Chinese EV companies developed 5-minute battery charging for EVs. Two Chinese companies, BYD and now battery maker CATL, have demonstrated 5-minute EV battery charging, suggesting that this will be the new standard in China. These new milestones make charging a Chinese EV nearly as fast as filling up with gasoline. CATL, the world's largest battery maker, said its flagship Shenzhen-backed battery could offer 520 kilometers of travel from 5 minutes of charging. This surpasses BYD's 470 kilometers and outpaces the fastest EV charging milestones of Tesla and Mercedes-Benz by a factor of 3 to 7. Some Western engineers have alleged that BYD's 5-minute charging was physiochemically impossible. However, with CATL corroborating and competing in the process, it seems that Chinese scientists are making the impossible possible and the possible routine. Chinese troops march in Vietnam. Chinese PLA troops have been marching to loud fanfare in Vietnam, where they have been invited to participate in the 50th anniversary celebration of the Vietnam War. The U.S. has told its diplomats not to attend this ceremony. China sent 300,000 troops to fight alongside the North Vietnamese during the 15-year struggle against U.S. imperialism. This invitation to China from Vietnam constitutes official recognition of the PLA's contribution to Vietnam's victory and demonstrates their intention to strengthen military cooperation. It signals a strong rebuttal to U.S. designs to peel Vietnam away from China as a partner in its escalation to war. The relationship between China and Vietnam is one of comradeship and brotherhood, Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun said after meeting his Vietnamese counterpart. President Donald Trump has claimed to be negotiating with China on tariffs, but China has denied that there is any existing dialogue. At the same time, the U.S. continues to insist that China must come to the table, while surreptitiously continuing to escalate military preparations against China. What are the impacts of these actions? We've asked Dr. Victor Gao to join us today. Dr. Gao is a professor at Soochow University, a lawyer, a businessman, and the vice president of the Beijing-based Center for China and Globalization. Welcome, Dr. Gao.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. Dr. Gao, I would like to jump right in and ask you, what are your thoughts about the current situation between the United States and China right now?
First of all, as far as China-US relations are concerned, my personal observation is that it is actually at the worst point since 1971, when Dr. Henry Kissinger made that important secret visit to China, and since 1972, when former President Nixon made a state visit to China, really opening the door of China-US relations, and since January the 1st, 1979, when China-US diplomatic relations were formalized. I think this is very dangerous. Now, when we look at this particular moment, of course, the deterioration is being caused by President Trump's global tariff war. It is not only a war against China, but against the rest of the world. Therefore, I think we need to be philosophical when we look at China-US relations at this particular point. We need to look at what exactly is happening in China-US relations, but also in terms of the global anti-free trade war launched by the United States.
Yes, and Dr. Gao, we know that trade, when it's conducted without coercion, results in win-win results. That is to say, both parties benefit. Parties get together and they're essentially exchanging what each one considers to be an equivalent, what each one is trying to get out of the situation. And therefore, trade is a win-win. And this kind of mercantile thinking is almost a throwback to the early 1800s, where countries believed that you had to have a positive balance of trade and a high stock of bullion in order to be considered wealthy. So this really goes against the trend and the thinking of several hundred years of economic analysis and understanding. But it seems like the US is deeply, deeply mired in this mindset. It also claims that doing so will help the United States re-industrialize. Now, we know that the United States has deindustrialized over 5 decades, and it moved its industrial manufacturing overseas, including in China. But what do you think the US is really aiming for as it puts forth these extraordinary tariffs against China? Certainly, it cannot be about reindustrialization, because we know that they've exempted, for now, electronics from import duties.
Well, you are raising a very important question, and I think to sufficiently address all your points, you probably need to write a book 1,000 pages long. However, due to the brevity of time we have in this discussion, allow me to make several very brief points. First, trade is good. Trade probably has been with mankind ever since mankind became mankind. In China, we call thing, for example, a thing, a physical thing, as East-West. East-West becomes a thing because you need to trade things from the East to the West or vice versa, and eventually nothing is a thing until it is being traded. In Chinese, we also call North-South as a commodity, a larger commodity, something larger than a thing, a small thing which you can trade on a daily basis. Now, in more recent time, free trade is a must. Free trade is the megatrend in the world. And I would say free trade has really been the main characteristic of the international situation ever since 1945, and also since the end of the Cold War in 1991. Now, for the United States to turn itself against free trade is not only surprising, it's alarming, and it's also very, very dangerous. Now, President Trump says, well, tariff is good, and the tariff is the best word in the English dictionary. I hope he will really be re-educated and relearn whatever he has learned. People around President Trump says, well, this has been his philosophy for decades. It is fine for tariff is good being the philosophy for Mr. Donald Trump when he is not the US president, but now he's the president of the United States, and to turn against a free trade is dangerous and very destructive of the fundamental interest of the American people. Now, President Trump says this is a reciprocal tariff. It is not reciprocal. I do not know who comes up with that formula, which is completely flawed and completely misleading. And I think it doesn't stand up to the scrutiny of a first grader in terms of mathematics or arithmetic, for example. Anyone who can count on his fingers will know that a reciprocal tariff formula is wrong and is misleading and is destructive of the fundamental interests of the American people. Now, the other point you mentioned is to recreate the manufacturing sectors in the United States, or bringing back manufacturing jobs back to the United States. Now, that in itself seems to be a worthy goal, but tariffs cannot help America to achieve that goal at all. Tariff will probably make it even worse in terms of reinvesting in manufacturing jobs in the United States. The other point, which is very, very important, is that President Trump claims to be very proud in collecting all these tariffs. He says $2 billion a day. Well, some other statistical bureau question the accuracy of the number, but let's put the number aside. Whether it is $200 million a day, $2 billion a day, or $20 billion a day, the tariffs are being paid by the American consumers. They are paid by the American people. I'm afraid more and more American people, when they do shopping in stores in the United States, will be hit by this tariff item. It is printed in front of their eye, And they will know that it is not China, it's not Europe, it's not ASEAN, it's not the African countries or the Arab countries, Latin American countries or Canada or Mexico, which are paying for these tariffs. These tariffs are being paid by the American people. So I think President Trump and his White House will have the minimum decency to tell the American people, yes, we are collecting all these tariffs, unprecedented in scale, but you are paying the tariffs. Then you do a survey of the people in the United States, whether they are willing to pay these tariffs, whether they want to buy goods made in China or anywhere else being exported to the United States without tariff, or are willing to pay the tariff. Now, talking about bringing in manufacturing jobs, I think the best teacher the United States can really learn from is China. Because to really attract all these manufacturing jobs, let me tell you, without charging any fee for your listeners, you need to do several things ahead of time. You need to build up your infrastructure and connectivity, meaning highways, railways, high-speed railways, ports of all kinds, and airports, facilities, inner water, canals, for example. You need to really completely upgrade the infrastructure and connectivity network in the United States. And this is a job not for 1 year or charging one tariff. This is a job for 50 years in a row, I'm afraid. Secondly, you need to significantly beef up your power generation. China uses electricity more than 6 times more than the United States in terms of industrial consumption of electricity. That means the United States really need to boost up its power generation multiple times before you can really expect to be able to accommodate all these manufacturing jobs. Now, thirdly, you really need to create a pro-business environment. Now, business really likes predictability and certainty and assurance. They cannot really operate in any meaningful way in a country or an environment where you have one way the first day, second way the other day, and a 180-degree reversal constantly, once every 4 years, or I agree to a contract or a convention with my neighboring countries, and then 4 years later, I completely tore the convention or the free trade agreement into pieces. This kind of the greatest predictability in the world of today is the unpredictability of the United States, and the greatest the certainty in the world of today is the uncertainty of the United States. Now, this is not pro-business. This is destructive of business. No meaningful businesses really want to invest in the United States in any significant amount. But you may say, well, President Trump says he attracted so much investment, etc., etc. Let me tell you, if you hold a gun to the head of any person or any country or any culture, that country may not have enough time to respond back to you. Many countries probably will kowtow to you, as President Donald Trump said. But that doesn't mean that they really support destruction of free trade. That doesn't mean that they do not know the basic corporate finance to do the calculation of whether the environment you are talking about is really attractive to doing business in your country. Therefore, I think you are talking about multiple things that the United States need to do. Now, another point, which is also very important, and most of the Americans probably will not like what I'm going to say, but this is really the hard truth. That is, you need to really train the labor force in such a way that they are disciplined, they are very eager to work, and then they may surprise you by accepting lower wages, not higher wages. The wage standard in the United States is way out of order if you compare with many other countries in the world. They are not competitive by any stretch of the imagination, especially for some of the blue-collar jobs, for example, in basic manufacturing. Now, the other thing I think even more importantly is whether the United States should really think about bringing back to the United States jobs in garment factory, clothing, for example, toys, shoes, etc. Now, these were important and very labor intensive, but these probably should not be seriously considered by the US government in terms of attracting back to the United States. The United States should really think about more high-tech jobs, for example, in AI, in semiconductors, for example. But even for those jobs, you are not going to really get a big mileage by holding a gun to other countries, for example, and issue administrative fiat to order other companies to move back to the United States. The United States, for many, many years, has prided itself as a capitalist country with market economy. But it seems to be that the United States is becoming a country by fiat, regardless of the fundamental economic logic, and holding a gun at the head of other countries, claiming that they achieve great success. No, that's not success. That's eroding your own so-called leadership, especially in the West, by creating doubt in your leadership, by destroying reliability of your leadership, and then you create more enemies rather than attracting more friends.
Absolutely, Dr. Gao. And, I think you're absolutely right. The United States is not doing the things that would be necessary if it were really serious about reindustrialization. Certainly, it doesn't have an industrial policy. It is not building the infrastructure that is necessary. Certainly, it's not doing the education. I think one illustrative figure, just one out of many, is that China spends 4 times as much on its education budget as it does on its military. Whereas for the United States spends 4 times as much on its military as it does its education. And it's actually looking forward to abolishing the ministry or the Department of Education. So these are deep contradictions. And as you point out, the fact that corporations go abroad and seek cheaper labor has to do with the international capitalist system, the global labor arbitrage. But here in the United States, the dollar is highly is overvalued, and at the same time, people working a full-time job, unless it's in some extraordinary sector, many people are having difficulty putting a roof over their heads and food on their table. I think the degradation of economic conditions is quite extraordinary, and it goes back to decades of neoliberal policy where both China and the United States benefited in their mutual exchange. But in China, the benefits of this exchange were turned into public wealth and used to bring up both the wages and the living standards of all the people, whereas in the United States, all of this added value, was extracted up to the oligarchs, the ruling class, and squandered on wars and the military. And I think there's this fundamental contradiction that the United States is unwilling to address or look at, which gets to the heart of the issues that we are facing. And I think the US, from this deep contradiction, is trying to apportion blame to China to make China the scapegoat of what is very, very clearly bad policy, oligarchical practices, and a general disregard for the welfare of its people.
Well, again, you are raising some very important questions, and I generally agree with the way you address these questions. Allow me to mention several points. One is the overseas wars. Now, the United States has been waging wars again and again and again for all these years. If you count all the wars the United States has been involved in since the end of the Cold War, holy cow. One Afghanistan war costs, according to different statistics, $2 trillion to $4 trillion. The Iraq war, the first one and the second one combined together probably would cost 4 trillion, if not $5 trillion. And then some of the costs are continuing going forward for decades. Now, the United States has also been very prone to use war as the main instrument to solve whatever geopolitical problems there are, rather than really focus on negotiations or diplomacy, for example. And that in itself is highly wasteful, because in China we have a saying, once you fire a cannon, it costs you 1 million ounces of gold. Now, whether it's 1 million or more or less, that's another question. But war is very, very expensive. And for the United States to be engaged in one war after another for decades in a row is hugely wasteful of the real national resources of the United States. Now, ever since the end of the Cold War in 1991, China has been involved in no war at all. So you can compare how China saved the money and how the United States wasted resources, practicing what a very important American professor of history said, overreach. You overreach in multiple directions, and eventually you bleed the American people out of their resources. And whatever resources there are highly, highly concentrated in the 1% of the population in the United States. Now, talking about building up connectivity, allow me to mention, when I first visited the United States back in 1984, I was so much amazed by the quality of the highways, power generation, and telecommunication to such an extent that I really felt very depressed, because I thought back in 1984 that in my lifetime, China would never have a chance to catch up with the United States in terms of the highways, in terms of the power generation, and telecommunication. Now, these three things were things I could see with my own eyes when I traveled from the West Coast to the East Coast, visiting quite a few large cities in the United States. But the reality is, today, in terms of telecommunication, highways, railways, airports, high-speed railways, ports, for example, of all kinds, China is way, way ahead of the United States. Now, I say this not to demonstrate that I'm very proud of these achievements. I say this equally for the purpose of letting my people and friends in the United States know that you really need to focus on what really counts and matters. You really need to pool resources to build up all these public goods, for example. And without these public goods, you live in the worst living standards. And then you really do not have the chance of coming up and really compete in the global sense of the word, to manufacture, to produce for yourself as well as for the rest of the world. Now, you also mentioned the importance of education. Of course, China now produces about 12 million college graduates every year. About 1/4 of them have engineering degrees. So in China, you have an ever-increasing large pool of talents, well-educated, well-trained, with engineering degrees, eager to work rather than eager to enjoy life. For most of the Chinese, for most of my compatriots, work is the best enjoyment for your life. By working very hard, you not only provide for yourself, for your kids, you also create conditions whereby you can send your kids to a better school so that they can have higher education than I have, for example, and they can really make greater contribution to the society at large. So for the United States, to boost revenue is a good thing, but the key is, how do you boost the revenue? And the second thing is to cut down cost by, let's say, Doge is in itself a good thing, but the key is, what kind of cost do you cut? Whether you cut funding of Harvard or Yale, and I was a graduate from Yale University's law school, for example. No, that's not really cutting cost. That's really cutting the future for your future generations of the American people. Now, you need to do the right thing. And then when you are at the end of your wits or the end of your wealth, whether you really think about creating your wealth in a legitimate way or keep an eye on the wealth of other countries and try really to seize their assets, seize their oil and gas reserve, seize their land, for example, that's another thing. That's not good. That's not to be accepted in the world of today. That's actually raising the dangerous tale of the passed away imperialism. And we are not living in an imperialistic world anymore. We are living in a multipolar world. Every country should be treated equally, and every country should treat all the other countries equally. MAGA, Make America Great Again, in itself is not a problem, but there is one precondition to that. Make America great again, not by making other countries less important, or by bullying other countries, or by holding a gun at the heads of the other countries. Because otherwise, you're not going to be great again. You probably will turn yourself into an empire with an emperor. But nobody wants to have a world dominated by empire, dominated by a single person who claims to be the emperor of the world of today. That's not a world of fun. That's a world of probably turmoil and internecine fighting, for example, war of all kinds, loss of order, and destruction of civilization.
I agree with you, except for one point where I would say that the United States already is an empire, and it is actually an empire on decline. And I think the fear amongst many of us, many people in the United States included, is as the empire unravels, the US is prone to use more and more violence to sustain it. I think even these tariffs are a form of economic violence, but I think there is a real and tangible fear that the US will resort to kinetic war to maintain its global hegemony. I believe that there are ideologues that still live in the 1990s in the unipolar moment. And I think one of the things that lets us know how much the United States is committed to war is first, the actions it is taking along the first island chain in the Philippines, in Korea, in Japan. Japan is already preparing to have a joint command like Korea, where the United States would have de facto operational control over its troops. You can see the escalation in the Philippines. You can see all the escalation on Taiwan Island. And I think that the United States is creating this almost intolerable situation of aggression where there's more and more military exercises, more and more firepower, and also more and more information warfare that it is using to undermine China. And I believe that these are actually signals that indicate that the US is actually strongly committed to going to war against China. What are your thoughts, Dr. Gao?
Well, you are raising another very important question. There are people in the United States who are talking about a destined for war scenario between China and the United States by raising this Thucydides trap theory. I'm actually firmly against that kind of theory because I think that very distinguished professor at Harvard, and I do not want to raise his name, everyone knows about that, a very distinguished professor whom I highly respect, is making one major academic flip or mistake because he analyzed many cases of war. And in a very scholarly and very professional way, he reached his conclusion. And he presented the theory to the world, to mankind, as if that's the truth, the possibility of war between rising nation and established power. Now, he forgot to tell mankind that all the cases of war he scholarly and professionally analyzed were conventional wars. And He wanted to apply the conclusion he so professionally arrived at by analyzing conventional wars to China and the United States, which are not only two largest conventional weapon powers, but also two very important nuclear power countries. Now, that's the fallacy. That's where the fallacy comes along, because we cannot apply the conclusions you arrive at by analyzing conventional wars to China and the United States. That's why I came up with a major refute in my own capacity. I called it the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. Why? Because in terms of conventional weapons, China and the United States, in my best judgment, are completely on the par with each other. Now, I say this with a little bit of modesty, not to make my friends in the United States too insane. But we can say conventional weapons complete parity between China and the United States. Now, in terms of nuclear war, you know the United States has the largest nuclear warhead, if not the second largest nuclear warheads in the world, thousands of nuclear warheads. And China has never published how many warheads they have. China's official response is that I will not tell you, and I will never use nuclear war ahead of anyone else. I will not be the first to use nuclear warhead. And I will not use nuclear weapons against any non-nuclear weapon countries or nuclear-free zones. But this is important. I will have enough nuclear warheads to wipe you out in my strike back at you if you dare to fight a nuclear war against China. That means this is the biggest strategic ambiguity you can expect in the world. You never know how many warheads China has, but China has told you they will have enough retaliatory capacity to wipe you out if you dare to impose a nuclear war on China. What does that mean? That means if the United States has the capability of wipe out the world or mankind 1,000 times, and China only has about 1% or 10% or whatever percentage of that of the United States, the end point is that there is no material difference because you do not need to wipe out the other side twice. You just need to have enough capability and national resolve to use that ultimate weapon if the other side imposes nuclear war on you. So wiping out 1,000 times is not materially different from wiping you out one time. That means between China and the United States, it is my firm belief, for the benefit of China as well as for the benefit of the American people, that war is not an option. War should not be an option. And both countries can wipe out each other multiple times. And the only way out is to engage with each other in peace, in respect, for mutual benefit, rather than scheming for a war. China is fully prepared to deal with whatever contingency you are talking about in peace, in war, or in the ultimate confrontation. Therefore, my point for Beijing as well as for Washington is let's quiet down, let's bring sanity back, let's engage each other on equal terms, let's talk about peaceful negotiation and dialogue rather than scheming to throw a wedge into the other side as if it can knock the other side down out of balance and throw it down on the ground as if there will be no consequences. That's not going to happen. Between China and the United States, war is not an option. Allow me to repeat that again. War is not an option between China and the United States. Why? Because both can wipe out each other multiple times. Don't pretend that you do not know. Don't pretend the United States has a superiority to achieve the first strike advantage to wipe out all the warheads in China. No, China has enough wherewithal to deal with the United States in war, conventional war, or nuclear war, or any other war, for example, without completely losing to the United States. So if war happens, the best scenario you can expect is mutual destruction. And that will be Armageddon for mankind. So why should anyone in a position of responsibility in the United States, in Washington, in the government, or in the Pentagon, or in the Congress, really want to risk mutual destruction between China and the United States. No. If anyone has that kind of weird idea in the United States, arrange a meeting for me and that person, whoever that person is, and I think I can talk him out or talk her out of a war scenario between China and the United States.
Dr. Gao, you are appealing to the rationality of the American leadership, and you are also trying to make clear that nuclear war would result in mutually assured destruction. But we also know that the US has a doctrine called NUTS, Nuclear Utilization Target Selection, which is the belief that if the US attacks first, and it attacks rapidly enough with a preemptive nuclear strike, then it will come out ahead. And it actually believes that it can win this war. And we know historically that the United States has, over many decades, plans to preemptively attack China. For example, in the 1960s, there was a plan called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, which was a plan to knock out 50 Chinese cities and destroy 70% of China's industry, essentially making it non-viable as a state. And my deep fear is that this ideology still is very, very deeply persistent in the highest echelon of the ruling class. We see the policy papers that are distributed right now in Washington, which say that the United States needs to find a seamless transition between the use of conventional weapons and tactical nuclear weapons. And from tactical nuclear weapons, it's just a very, very small step towards strategic nuclear weapons. And at the same time, they know that China, it does not have launch on warning, that it has a minimal nuclear deterrent, and that it also detaches its warheads from its delivery vehicles. So I think there are some very, very deeply cynical and opportunistic thinkers in the US ruling class that are actually considering the use of nuclear warfare as a way to subjugate and to destroy China. But I want to go to a little clip. This is Mike Wallace speaking with the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. Now, this is in the 1950s, a long, long time ago. And Reinhold Niebuhr is considered to be the ethical architect of U.S. foreign policy. Let's watch that clip.
I think it was Bertrand Russell who fairly recently said, and other people have said it along with him, that if it came to communism or nuclear war, communism or possible incineration, they'd choose to live under communism. How do you feel about that?
Well, about Bertrand Russell, I know that he's a great philosopher or logical mathematician, but I think my friend Sidney Hook is right about it. All the achievements in this field are no substitute for common sense. And what Bertrand Russell is saying is that capitulation to communism is better than a nuclear war, but that isn't the point. We have to risk a nuclear war in order to escape capitulation to communism. For all I know, we may stumble into this terrible war, but no nation can say we will capitulate to tyranny rather than accept a speculative fate.
So, Dr. Gao, I mean, this man is the individual who was not only the architect of the ethical foundations of U.S. foreign policy, but he was a very, very influential mentor to generations of U.S. thinkers, academics, and policymakers. And essentially, his argument is that if we strip away the labels and apply them to the modern era, he's simply saying that it is better to be dead than red. And I think that this thinking is deeply, deeply embedded inside the US ruling class.
My philosophy and the megatrend in China is that Your God for you, my God for me. You believe in whatever color you want to choose, and I believe in the color of my choice. You worship your God, I worship my God. Never impose your God on me, and I will never impose my God on you. That's the only right thing between China and the United States.
I want to thank you, Dr. Gao, for staying late and giving so generously of your time. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to having you on the show again.
Thank you very much for having me. Bye-bye.
And finally, to close out our show today, we are happy to share with you a demonstration of Tai Chi Chuan. Tai Chi is a martial art known for its cultivation of elastic, resilient, internal strength, which our young practitioner demonstrates with grace, elegance, and power.